It's the summer of 1990, and instead of a VCR or a new stereo, a family is hauling a big blue IBM box into the living room. Out comes a squat little system unit, a TV-like VGA monitor, and a tangle of thick cables that somehow all end up at the back of the screen. They plug it in, hit the power button, and instead of a cryptic C prompt, the screen blooms into a colorful four-panel menu. One square for software, one for online services, one for files, one for setup. Somewhere inside, a 2400 baud modem is quietly waiting to dial Prodigy. This is IBM's PS1. Not a beige office workhorse bolted under a desk, but a home computer meant to sit next to the family TV. The curious part is why IBM, the company of buttoned-up mainframes and the serious business PS2 line, suddenly wanted its logo sitting on a shelf between microwave ovens and camcorders. To understand the PS1, you have to rewind to IBM's first stab at the home market. The PCjr, launched in 1984. On paper, it sounded like a friendly little sibling to the IBM PC. In practice, it was more like the awkward cousin nobody invited back. The PCjr shipped with a famously awful chiclet keyboard, limited memory, and odd cartridge slots that made it feel more like a game console than a real PC. More importantly, it wasn't fully compatible with the software businesses were actually using. People wanted the IBM name, but they also wanted to run Lotus 123 without weird glitches. Reviews were lukewarm, sales were worse, and by 1985 IBM quietly pulled the plug. After that, there was no IBM-branded computer aimed squarely at the living room. While clones crept into homes, IBM retreated back to its comfort zone: business machines. IBM's next big move was the PS2 line in 1987, a bold attempt to reset the entire PC ecosystem. It introduced high-resolution graphics, 3.5-inch discs, and, most controversially, the proprietary micro-channel architecture. Micro-channel was powerful, but it was also IBM saying, "We're in charge again." Expansion cards needed special licensing, and the machines came in a confusing blur of model numbers and configurations. That was tolerable in a corporate purchasing department. It was a non-starter for a parent wandering into a store with a credit card. By the late 80s, IBM still dominated office floors, but the living room was a different story. Cheaper, fully compatible clones from companies like Compaq, Packard Bell, and countless no-name brands filled the gap. They might not have carried the same prestige, but they ran the same software for a lot less money. By 1990, IBM knew it needed something simpler, cheaper, and much friendlier. The answer was the personal system, the One, usually just called the PS1. The goal was explicit: a computer for the computer-phobic. It had to be easy enough for a first-time user, but not so toy-like that enthusiasts would immediately outgrow it. IBM's own marketing talked about a family machine you could unpack, plug in, and use in minutes, with prices from just under $1,000 up to around $2,000, depending on memory, display, and hard disk options. Equally radical was where it would be sold. Instead of corporate resellers, PS1s showed up in consumer electronics chains, sitting beside offerings from Compaq, Hewlett-Packard, and Packard Bell. US versions even shipped with a built-in modem and pre-configured online access through Prodigy and Quantum's Promenade service, turning IBM's support lines into something you dialed up from the couch. The PS1 officially debuted on June 26, 1990, with the first model range built around the 2011 design. Inside was a 10 MHz Intel 8286 processor, 512 kilobytes or 1 megabyte of RAM, and on higher configurations, a 30 megabyte hard drive. Later variants nudged that up to 40 megabytes. In a very home computer touch, IBM stored PC-DOS 4.01 in ROM alongside a graphical shell, so turning the system on dropped you straight into that four-quadrant menu instead of a blinking cursor. For a nervous first-time owner, it really did feel more like turning on an appliance than booting a mini mainframe. The physical design, though, raised eyebrows. The power supply lived in the CRT monitor, not in the system unit, and a proprietary cable linked the two. It kept the little desktop box compact and reduced clutter, but when the monitor died, so did your whole computer. Original US prices ran from about $990 for a monochrome VGA setup, without a hard disk, up to around $1,999 for a color system with a hard drive. Under the hood, the PS1 was surprisingly down to earth. Where the PS2 line leaned into microchannel and a sense of engineered exclusivity, the PS1 quietly embraced more standard PCAT-style technology. Graphics were straight VGA, not some exotic IBM-only variant. Storage used IDE hard drives, the same basic interface many clone PCs of the era relied on. Later PS1 desktops and towers exposed industry-standard ISA expansion slots. In other words, IBM's supposedly low-end home line was, architecturally, closer to the clone ecosystem than its own business flagships were. That made life easier for software developers and, in theory, for owners who wanted to plug in off-the-shelf expansion cards or drives. At least once the hardware designs actually surfaced those standard connectors. For early PS1 buyers, standard connectors were more a promise than a reality. The original 2011 case had no internal ISA slots at all. It was meant to be a sealed little appliance. If you wanted expansion, you had to buy IBM's external adapter card unit, a roughly $169 add-on box that sat under the system and held up to 3 ISA cards. Memory was also an exercise in brand loyalty. The machine started with 512 kilobytes or 1 megabyte on board, but upgrades came on proprietary modules, up to about 2.5 megabytes. They were simple to install, but not cheap. IBM even offered a 5.25-inch external floppy unit, and for those with very deep pockets, a CD-ROM drive that could be bolted underneath for close to $1,000. All of this fit the original vision of a beginner-friendly system. But it meant that anyone who grew beyond basic word processing and online services quickly ran into a wall of IBM-branded accessories. By 1992, many PS1 owners had learned their way around DOS and wanted more speed and memory. IBM's answer was the 2121 series, which kept the overall look of the original but modernized the internals. Out went the 286. In came Intel's 8386 SX at 16 or 20 MHz. Base RAM jumped to 2 megabytes and you could climb to 6 megabytes with another proprietary module. Hard drives grew to 40, 80, or even over 100 megabytes depending on the exact submodel. US configurations like the C42 and B82 bundled preloaded Microsoft Works, DOS, and in some cases Windows 3.0, plus Prodigy and Promenade access. Crucially, some 2021 versions finally added 1 or 2 ISA slots inside the main case, reducing dependence on the external adapter card unit. But IBM still clung to custom memory and that monitor-based power supply. So it was progress with asterisks. Around 1992-93, IBM experimented with a slightly more ambitious PS1, based on a PS2-style desktop case. This 2123 model, sometimes marketed in certain regions or ads as a PS1 Pro or a limited edition, stepped up to a 20 MHz 386SX with standard 72-pin SIM expansion and several ISA slots. Unlike the original all-in-one feel, the 2123 looked and behaved much more like a conventional PC clone. It used a separate power supply, more ordinary connectors, and was comfortable running mainstream DOS and Windows software of the day. Exactly how widely IBM pushed the Pro branding and in which markets is fuzzy in surviving documentation. But machines like the 2123 show IBM edging away from the sealed appliance idea and toward what home users increasingly wanted: a reasonably priced IBM-badged box that didn't fight them every time they tried to upgrade something. As the line evolved, IBM added even more conventional PS1 models, the 2133 and 2155 desktops, and later the 2168 Tower. Their nicknames, 3x3, 5x5, 6x8, hinted at how many expansion slots and drive bays each offered. By this stage, PS1s could house 486XX and 486DX processors at speeds up to the familiar 486DX266, with room for VISA local bus graphics cards and far more memory than any early PS1 owner could have imagined. These later systems dropped the ROM-based DOS and the monitor power supply trick, leaning heavily on more standard parts. Side by side with IBM's next consumer brand, Aptiva, they almost blur together. Some historians suspect the early Aptiva designs were direct descendants of these last PS1 towers. The journey from the tidy 2011 to a full 486 tower says a lot about the early 90s PC market. Even home machines were being pulled toward the modular, upgradable clone template. In reviews at the time, the PS1 generally delivered what IBM promised. Writers praised how quickly you could get from sealed box to working system, and that friendly startup menu, bundled Microsoft Works, and crisp VGA display all helped ease people into personal computing. But there were also grumbles. The DOS shell interface felt clumsy once you tried to do more than the basics, and IBM's documentation was notoriously thin. Fine when you were terrified of manuals. Less helpful once curiosity kicked in. The built-in modem was convenient for Prodigy, but poorly documented for other services. And things like the tight keyboard layout and inflexible mouse settings drew their share of muttering. Exact sales figures are hard to pin down. Different sources give very different numbers, and IBM didn't break them out clearly. What's clear is that the PS1 sold respectably, but it never dominated home computing the way the original IBM PC had dominated business. By 1994, IBM retired the PS1 brand and replaced it with the more modern-sounding Aptiva line. The company had learned a few hard lessons along the way. One was that home users might be nervous at first, but they didn't stay that way. A machine designed as therapy for the computer phobic, as one reviewer put it, quickly felt cramped once those same users started installing Windows, playing games, or adding peripherals. Locking basics like memory and monitors behind proprietary designs only pushed them toward more flexible clones. Another lesson was that IBM couldn't ignore industry standards at home while trying to control them in the office. The PS1's gradual shift from sealed appliance to fairly ordinary 486 tower mirrors, the broader PC story. Open architectures, standard parts, and upgradable cases won. Today, the PS1 sits in museums and basements as a reminder of an awkward but earnest moment when IBM tried to put its logo back in the living room and had to relearn what personal in personal computer really meant.